Some have said Africans are not yet ready to be free. Others have said we're not yet civilized enough. To this, we give a simple answer. Civilized or not civilized, ignorant or illiterate, rich or poor, we, the African states, deserve a government of our own choice. Let us make our own mistakes, but let us take comfort in the knowledge that they are our mistakes. Tom Mboya.
Hi, my name is Ngina.
And I'm Mehek.
And we are the Disruptors. This isn't just history, it's Kenya's story, unruly, untamed. In this season, we embark on the suspense-filled political assassinations in post-independence Kenya. So stay comfortable, stay curious, and lean back into the unknown.
Today, we're talking about the original Mr. Dimples of Kenya, Tom Mboya, or, Thomas Joseph Mboya.
Yes.
And an interesting life. I'll have Gina take it over first, taking us all the way back to Mr. Toddler Mboya.
So Tom Mboya was born in 1930. He was born in a family that was working in the Settler Highlands in Kilimambogo, close to Thika, those sides. It was a sisal plantation. And they were in abject poverty. The dad was only being paid around £3 a month or a year, if I'm not wrong. And so he was born, of course, he has other siblings. Around 1939, he starts school. And he's taken to Ukambani region. That's what they would call it back then. He's taken to Kaba. It's a mission school, obviously. And it's here where he learns the culture and picks up the language that is Kamba. So he does this, and then after a few years again, 1942, around there, he's taken to St. Mary's Yala. While in St. Mary's Yala, he studies English and history. Of course, he's very fond of this. We'll come to see how good of an orator he is with his English. Yeah. And then he goes back to Kikuyu region again, and he continues with his studies over there. Around 1946, they say Holy Ghost College, which is now known as Mangu, if I'm not wrong. And again, over there, he picks up the Kikuyu language. He learns the custom and cultures of the Kikuyu people. So this is a man, even before we talk of English and Kiswahili, he's already learned the Luo, he's learned Kamba, and he's learned Kikuyu. And this is something that will help him. Like, it will be something that will be seen even in his political life, because he's not... Ogot, Professor Ogot describes it perfectly. He says Tom Mboya was not a tribalist, like he was anti-tribalist, because he had immersed himself in all these cultures. So, I mean, who would be a tribalist if he's able to appreciate all these cultures? So after he studies, he doesn't necessarily finish school because of, again, lack of funds, but he joins the city council. And he is a sanitary officer. And this is where we now start seeing Tom Mboya's personality coming out, right? So it's at City Council where he now starts getting into the labor unions and the kind of stuff. While he's in Kikuyu region, he's an altar boy. And he actually feels like he's going to be a priest. But of course, he's in a mission school, and of course, he's now interacting with missionaries. And it's in these interactions with the missionaries that he realizes, nope, I'm not going to be a priest. I'm going to get into fighting for my land. It's like the fire is now lit. And the reason why he sees it this way is because he feels like the missionaries are just like any other colonialist and settler. He feels, so in his interactions, he realizes that the missionaries are still the same people who are instilling this fear of telling Africans that you're not yet advanced.
Exactly.
And the worst part is that they say, the Lord will reveal to you when you're ready. For advancement.
Jesus,
I know.
Okay.
Crazy. And so he feels like they're the same. They're all the same. All they do is instill this fear and this inferiority complex that Africans can't do this. Africans can't study. Africans can't
do anything,
basically. Yeah. And so now this is when he decides I'm not going to be a priest. Yeah. So he goes into the city council and he is given the position of sanitary officer. And again, so he has this fire burning in him, right? And now he decides, he starts touching into things called labor unions. So labor unions basically fighting for workers' rights and the like. We all know what the function of labor unions are. But of course, he's working for the white man.
Yeah.
And so the white man starts suspecting him that there's something going on. What is this guy doing in city council? And just before he's actually fired, he resigns.
Smart move.
Well, is it?
I mean,
yeah, well, in that time, yes, it was a very smart move. So he decides to resign before he's kicked out. And then now he gets in completely, he throws himself completely into the labor unions and the like. And one thing to just note is that while he's at city council, he tries to open a labor union. And then afterwards, so after he's left the city council, now he plunges himself fully into trade unions. And we all know in the fight for independence that trade unions were a very major, they were very key in fighting for independence and self-rule and the like. They were the non-violent option, basically. There are two ways of fighting for independence, the violent and non-violent. Tom Mboya has always been on the non-violent side. And it's something that we cannot disregard because they did play a very huge role when it comes to the independence. So young Tom Mboya is now climbing the ranks. He's an orator. He's known of how he speaks. And he's actually the young age of 28. Yeah. What were you doing at 28? No, you're not yet 28. Not yet 28. But what are most 28-year-olds doing? Something with their lives. So first of all, he helps create trade unions, not only in Kenya. He helps create them in Uganda, Tanzania, and across Africa. And then now at 28, he's chosen as a chairman of the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions. And he's also the African representation for all these unions, right? And so around 1959, they have a meeting in Nigeria, and they now create an all-African International Confederation of Free Trade Unions. And that's how we know him as. He's talking all over Africa. He's literally fighting for better conditions, more representation using the trade unions. And he actually works very closely with Pan-Africanist Kwame Nkrumah. Yes, take it away.
And that's how he actually enters into politics, right? So I think it's a very common route for a lot of politicians back then. They would go into trade union movements and then, join KANU later on. And we kind of see a similar pattern with Mboya. So when Mboya started one of the labor movements in Kenya, the KFL, and he started working internationally, he also started dabbling in politics in Kenya at that point. Around this time, actually, we see Mboya does receive what we call like a scholarship. It was sort of a scholarship all the way to Oxford. He studied at Ruskin College for a bit. And by the time he returns, it's around 1956. We have more representation in LegCo, the Legislative Council. And he actually becomes a Nairobi rep, which is something we covered briefly in one of our previous episodes with Ngala and Kodek as well. And when he's at LegCo, he's also secretary of IMO. He's doing a lot of things. You're already doing labor union work, but now you're dabbling in politics when you're back. And he's also agitating for the release of Mzee and the rest of the Kapenguria Six. But he realizes something very fundamental when he's at LegCo, and it's that despite the fact that now, Africans can take a part in politics and determining their own self-rule, it wasn't enough. There wasn't enough representation, and he would go on to form the Nairobi People's Convention Party in 1957. And he actually would run for politics with them for quite some time until Mzee comes back, right? And that's when, all the political parties dissolve, everyone joins KANU. But in the middle of this, I think Mboya does one of the most impactful things we've ever seen in our Kenyan history, which was the student airlifts. So starting in 1959, Mboya begins this very, very ambitious program called the Airlift program. And the whole idea was to send bright scholars, bright Kenyan scholars, men, women, to the United States to pursue further degrees. And all this was to be funded, of course, through various grants and scholarships. So when Mboya was actually on a tour in the Americas, he was now collecting these scholarships, collecting these funds. And his hard work allowed him to send about 81 people to the United States. This is in the first airlift. And during this time, Tom Mboya meets a very, very young Pamela Odede, Walter Odede's daughter. And when I say very young, I mean very young. There was quite a sizable gap between the two of them. And as we all know later on, him and Pamela get married. I'm not pointing any fingers, but there was something going on. I'm not going to use a G word, but it probably happened. So anyways, the first airlift of 1959 sees 81 bright young scholars go to the Americas to study. And it's such a success that a lot of them actually do come back to help develop the country, right? Mboya's entire vision was, we need an educated front. We need people who are educated who, when we gain independence, we are able to run the country on our own terms. So that's kind of where we're getting at. And then what happens is, because again, Mboya, best friends with, you'll be surprised, but he was best friends with a lot of people. Best friends with JFK, with the Kennedys. And this is where now, many of you may have heard it as the Kennedy airlifts. But the second airlifts of 1960 were actually funded by JFK. So there's a political reason for this as well. It's not just that they were buddy-buddy and JFK decided he's going to give $100,000 to Mboya. Kennedy also realized, if I support this movement, I get the African-American vote in America. So it was a political play for him, and it worked out pretty well for Mboya. And we kind of see the second airlift have some really, really important names go out. A few of them, just to mention, one of them is Wangari Maathai. Wangari Maathai. We have Barack Obama Sr. Yes, Barack Obama's father. And we also have a very interesting character who would, in the later airlifts, called Nahashan Joroge, right?
Yeah.
Just stick on to that name. So we have the American and Canadian airlifts going on between 1959 and 1961. The airlifts kind of expand in the sense that instead of just Kenyan students going out, we have students going from Uganda, Tanzania, Malawi, and Zimbabwe at that time. It was quite a huge success. And unfortunately, the airlifts do meet a natural end by 1963. Around this time, Mboya had tried to send a few more people to different places through the airlifts. There's one where they were sending students to Bulgaria, where Nahashan finds himself studying at a military school. He was handpicked by Mboya, Njire, and Jaramogi Odinga. And, at that point, because of how messy, I don't want to say messy, but if you were to compare the earlier streamlines and what was going on during the Bulgarian ones, they realized it wasn't streamlined enough. The Minister of Education at that point, Otiende, he actually wrote to the government and said, we need, what's going on here? What exactly is going on here? And we kind of just see the airlifts come to an end at that point. However, the airlifts educated quite a huge chunk of people who would end up being either politicians or officers or diplomats within our country themselves, right? I mean, Wangari Maathai, right? And so that's kind of where he is at 1963, but he's still in politics and very, very involved. So again, as I'd mentioned earlier, parties started dissolving around 1961. They were joining KANU at this point because the Kapenguria 6 had been released and they were back in full force. Mboya actually becomes Secretary General, and he holds that post until later on, even after independence. And he also plays an extremely key role in the Lancaster House conferences. He was out there championing for change with his perfect English and perfectly written letters and everything. But then we move into because we're now moving into independence, and I think I'll let Kina take this because it gets really interesting at this point.
So just before independence, during the Lancaster House conferences, so it's quite obvious that Kenya is getting independence. Yep. So now we have to start thinking of what our constitution is going to look like. And that's where we see Tom and Ngala rubbing shoulders a bit.
Yes.
Listen to the Ngala episode. So he's more of a centralized government, right? But also, in as much as there's politics, there's the aesthetics, right? And this, I'm calling it aesthetics, but it's something very powerful till date. And that's our flag, our Kenyan flag. Yeah, the Kenyan flag. And they have to design the Kenyan flag in 1961 as we're still discussing the what Kenya is going to be when we gain independence. So we now know he's the Secretary General of KANU, right? But, and the colors of KANU flag were black, red, and green.
Don't forget the jogo.
Yes, there was the jogo as well. But the main colors were black, red, and green. And the reason why these colors were chosen, Mzee describes it perfectly. He says the black, the African has had to fight for his land by shedding a lot of blood. That's why we get the representation of the colors, right? And then we have the jogo. But Tom comes in and he really discourages against that. He's like, no, we're not doing that. Let's not be like Tanzania and Uganda, who've taken the main party flags as their national flags. It will make us a very polarized, it will make us polarized politically, yeah? And so he tells them, no, let's combine the colors from the KADU flag and now bring it together with the KANU flag. And so what colors were they bringing in from the KADU flag? The white. But now the white in KADU flag was to show how multiracial the country is, right? But then there was that aspect of having to feel like it's Kenyan. It's a very Kenyan and not feel like a very multiracial country, right?
Yeah.
So the white comes into the flag
as peace
and unity. Unity, unity, which is something that Mboya really fought for. And then now they decide to design together the shield and the arrows and everything. That's how we get our flag, our beautiful flag, because of Mboya's insistence.
Thank you, Mboya.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Because if there
we
was
have a very beautiful flag.
I just, if you guys have seen the picture of the KANU flag, we won with the flag we have right now. Yeah. But tell me about the national anthem. I love that story so much, and I think you're perfect to tell it. So go ahead.
Yeah. So with the Kenyan anthem now, of course, we were a British colony. We all know how the British anthem goes, guys. And
God save the Queen, whatever the rest of it is.
There's a specific tune, and a couple of countries in Africa have that tune. And Mboya comes in and says, no, we're not going to do that. So what does he do? He goes to the organist at All Saints Cathedral at the time, who was Graham Hislop. He was a white man, British as well. But he tells him, so here's the thing. I need you to create a tune for the Kenyan anthem. We do not want the generic British tune to be our anthem, right? So ideas are thrown off. They're like, oh, we should do a public competition to see who will win. So, and then whoever will win, that will be our anthem. Mboya says, no, number one, time constraint. We have other things to be discussing. Independence is coming. We need to be able to have an anthem. So time constraint. And he also is against it because he's like, the minute we get into a competition, he puts it well, he says, an Odiero will win. In this way, he's just describing that a wealthy man or a white man might win that competition, and then we'll get something that's not even in tune with us, right? Yes. So Graham Hislop is an organist at the All Saints Cathedral, but he is very well versed with the Pokomo tunes, with the Pokomo traditional tunes. And he was very good at combining the Pokomo tunes and modernized or westernized tunes, for lack of a better word. And that's how we get, so he picks up the Pokomo lullaby and he brings out this beautiful tune. But he doesn't work alone. So there's a commission that's put in, and There's Professor Washington Omondi. He brings in Professor George Senogazake. There's Peter Kibukosia and Thomas Kalume. So he gives them 7 weeks to work on this anthem, right? And Graham decides because so they write 2 tunes. By the way, the English national anthem is not a direct translation from the Kiswahili national anthem. Let's make that clear right now. So we have 2 different anthems, the English and the Kiswahili, to represent the 2 national languages that we have, right? And then we have the tune and the words. So who is going to play? We still need to remember there was a lot of segregation at the time. So High Slope. High Slope tells these guys, you need to find a black choir that will sing this. And who do they go to? They go to Alliance High School, and they get guys to actually sing the anthem. And that's how we come up with a very beautiful anthem because of the works that Mboya did in the background and ensuring that our culture is infused into our anthem, which I think is a very beautiful thing to do, because we would have had the generic tune at the moment that is in almost all British colonies. Yeah.
Thank God for that as well.
I know, right?
Such a visionary. But then, so, we've seen that Mboya is doing so much already. We've gained independence. Fun fact about independence. So when the flag was unfurled at Uhuru Gardens, very few people knew the national anthem at that point. It was just the committee and the choir. So it was, I think it would have been really interesting for the first time to hear that, right? And then now we're free, technically. And we are reaching a point in Kenyan politics where now we've transitioned from independence politics to now, how do we now move forward as a free country? How do we move forward as a republic? Just to give a brief overview of kind of some of the positions that Mboya held. Mboya would go on to become a Minister for Labor, Minister for Justice and Constitutional Affairs, and most notably, Minister for Economic Planning and Development. The 7% growth that we see after independence is actually all down to Mboya. The credit all goes to him. And one of the most notable things Mboya continues to do post-independence is propose something called the Cessational Paper Number 10. We've kind of mentioned this in the Pinto episode a little bit, and also some point in Gala's episode. The Cessational Paper Number 10 was kind of an in-between between capitalism and socialism. Mboya was not a fan of textbook socialism or Western capitalism, as much as people would be surprised to hear that. He wanted something that would work for Kenya. And the Cessational Paper Number 10 was actually like African socialism. But it was done in a way that was tailored for the continent, that was tailored for the country. And he had quite interesting demands. He wanted quite a lot of things. He wanted us to have a fair, equal distribution of resources, and he wanted politics to be done in a certain way. But sadly, that doesn't happen, doesn't take place. It's important to note that Cessational Paper Number 10 does pass in theory. Yeah. It's there. It was never followed. And the reason for this happened 55 years ago on Government Road, what is now called Moi Avenue. Mboya would end up losing his life. 1969 was a treacherous year for Mboya. Early on in the year, he had an attempt made on his life. And later on, actually, his friends were actually really concerned for his life. As we approached around June, July, Mboya had gone for a conference in Ethiopia. And while he was there, the rumors surrounding the fact that if Mboya came back, he would be murdered, were starting to take hold in the country. And a lot of his friends advised Mboya, hey, we understand that you want to come back to the country and then make it to your next conference in the UK. However, we suggest that maybe you should head on to the UK directly from Addis instead of coming back to Nairobi. But Mboya, being Mboya, said that would just be delaying the inevitable. And so he comes back to Nairobi in 1969. So in July, 5th July 1969. Mboya in this suede blazer, in his fancy Mercedes, pulls up to Government Road, and he parks just by Chinese pharmacy. These were people he was friends with, the semi-Chinese. They were both a couple who ran a pharmacy along Government Road, which is now Moi Avenue. So he walks in, he's come there to make a purchase. He's talking to the wife. They're having an amicable conversation, a very nice conversation, just what you'd expect a few friends to have when they're catching up briefly.
Mm-hmm.
Mboya makes his purchase, makes his payments. The Chinese bid him farewell. And the moment he opens the door of the pharmacy to step out onto Government Road, a shot goes off right into Mboya's chest. Another one goes off, hits his shoulder, but at this point, Mboya is down. The pharmacists, Mrs. Semi and Mr. Semi Chani, they're trying their best to do whatever they can to keep Mboya responsive as they wait for the ambulance to come. Outside on the road, there's a crowd that's forming. People have heard the shots. People knew that Mboya was there. It's not that hard to miss a Mercedes and a guy in a suede jacket walking around, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a crowd forming. And sadly, at that point, whoever shot Mboya had made it away in the confusion of the whole thing. Mboya would be taken to Nairobi Hospital. And we actually have pictures of everything that's going on because Mohammed Amin was actually the first photojournalist on site, capturing every step that went on. So from when he was shot to when he was taken into the ambulance and to when he was taken to Nairobi Hospital. So Mboya is on his way to Nairobi Hospital. Dr. Rafiq Chaudhry and his team are trying everything they can to keep him alive, to keep him safe. They have this pump that they're trying to just, keep sure that oxygen is going to his brain. They think it's working. They reach Nairobi Hospital and the crowd that had formed is starting to follow them to Nairobi Hospital, right? Mboya is announced dead. The bullet went straight into his chest. There was no saving him. The pump that they were using wasn't even working. Actually, it was recalled a while back because it didn't do anything. And the doctors fully believed that they were helping him, that they were doing something to save him. Mboya died, and so did the spirit of the nation. I think it's safe to say. The entire country wept for this man because of his vision for the country, because of his interaction with the people, regardless of his politics, regardless of what people thought of him, maybe as a Western stooge. We see a country go into shock. Mind you, we already had a number of assassinations. A month before this was our friend Kodak, right?
Yeah.
The country is scared. Because if someone can go after a top politician like Mboya, what does it entail for the country itself? There is the energy around the time. Remember, it's just been a few years since independence. This is 69. We were freed a few years back, 6. There's still a lot of tribalist divides in the country going on. And there is a strong, strong belief amongst people at that point that this was, number one, a political move, and number two, it was probably done by the government. We see the government actually respond to this claim in a very, I would call it a very interesting
press conference.
So then Vice President Daniel Arap Moi, who would go on to become Kenya's president for 25 years later on. 24 years, sits down and gives a press conference whereby he says that basically points fingers at the Chinese for Mboya's murder. But Professor Ogot puts it very well that Kenyans did not take it. They did not believe it at all, and they fully knew that they were being misled. And that kind of leads us to an even more messier aftermath following that press conference.
Mm-hmm. So, of course, after someone is dead, there's the mass and everything. So, during Tom Mboya's Requiem Mass at the Holy Cathedral, Zay, shows up. And to give you guys context of what happens on that day, I'll take you a little back to 1968, where there are rumors around Mzee getting heart attacks. And so the topic of succession comes about. We all know how Kenyan politics is. Whenever there's a president, the next thing is who will succeed him and all that kind of thing. So now there's a lot of conspiracy theories going on. The government has talked about the Chinese embassy. The Kenyans are feeling, no, we know it's not the Chinese embassy. And this actually materializes on the day of the mass. So during the mass, Mzee is actually in his Mercedes, bulletproof Mercedes. He's he's going into the church for the mass, and people show up, and they don't show up to celebrate the man. No, they've shown up to protest in a way. So it's a protest, and the police actually have to bring out the batons and tear gas to disperse these people. And you can see the unrest between the two groups, right? And then at the same time, it should be notable that there was a lot of ethnic politics. So it now started being a question of Luo versus Kikuyus
right.
and the like, which I think Tom Mboya would be so disappointed if he saw that.
But then during the whole, like the riots and everything, I think the scenes outside, yes, they were hectic, right? The police are trying to keep these people at bay. They're here to mourn Mboya, but they're also here to vent their frustration because they fully believe that the man who's walked in has some form of hand behind
Tom
Mboya's
Mboya's
death.
Yeah.
At the same time, the people sitting inside the church, I mean, you're already in so much grief. You've lost someone, and then you have to fight off because the tear gas was spilling into the place. So now they're little kids. I'm pretty Mboya's kids were quite young at that point. Like, you're here to mourn. They're old people in there. There's tear gas being thrown around. And the entire funeral turned into something else.
Yeah. The
and
mass.
we actually see Kenyatta being ferried off.
Yes.
Because actually two people do get killed in this, and as well as a police officer. And yeah, that leads us to like Kenyatta actually having to leave the mass, the funeral at some point.
Yeah, he does leave the mass, and he doesn't even attend the funeral. And so after the mass, of course, there's the funeral, and they take him back home, not to Kilimambogo, but they now take him to Rusinga Island. And it's notable. I think one thing that we have to bring out is what Jaramogi said on during the funeral. He talks about how politics has completely changed in Kenya. And he knew that after Mboya's death, he knew he was going to have a very rough time in Kenyan politics.
Yes.
He also says that in as much as sometimes him and Mboya were not agreeing on their ideologies, they were still friends. And there were points where they were agreeing, right? And and so he just talks of it, and he kind of seconds Mboya's beliefs around the fight for freedom, and the fight for actual freedom takes a very, very long time. So Mboya is buried in Rusinga, and there's only one Kikuyu who shows up for that funeral.
J.M. Kariuki.
Yeah, a man who will end up being assassinated as well because of his beliefs. One thing we need to realize is that there's a lot of discussion around succession and land. The land issue in Kenya is still an issue, is a very big thing. Mboya was always the person, it was very controversial of him, but he saw land as a very national thing instead of as an ethnic asset, which was controversial.
Still is,
yes. So he is laid to rest in Rusinga, and the mausoleum is out there in Rusinga till date. And now, of course, so the person who shot him is still. So we come back to this side.
Remember that name I told you guys to keep a note on?
Yeah.
So
Nahashon Njoroge is arrested for Tom Mboya's death. And to give you guys what the Bulgarian airlifts were like, the Bulgarian airlifts were more military. They were going to be trained. And he's actually known as the Bulgaria trained killer. He's known as that. And he's arrested. And he actually says, why don't you go for the big man? Which adds more question marks to this whole story. Now we have the Chinese government, there's the Kenyan government, and then the big man. So who's the big man? Yeah. And just to give you guys a little bit of background with Nahashan was military, proper military. But when he came back to Kenya, since the British were still the ones funding the Kenya Armed Forces, the Kenya Armed Forces, he was not allowed back into it because they said that we won't have people who have been trained by a communist state to get into the army, the Kenyan army. So he was very trained, but he didn't have a job. But he's known to be the guy, the one who was taken to, like he was, how's it called? I'm trying to find the term for it. He was the person who...
contract killer.
Yeah, a contract killer. And he was also known to be the person to go threaten different businesses. If,
So almost like a shark.
Yes.
A lone shark.
Yes. Yes. So he's arrested and he's actually tried. And they say that he's going to be executed. Now it gets even more messy, guys. Stay comfortable, yeah? Open-minded. So this execution is done in secret. Let's just start there, which is very, very weird, considering the beloved son of the country is gone. So he's executed. But then, a year later, an MP called Morara shows up. And he was in Zambia at the time. And I think he passed by a bar or something like that. And then he comes back and he says, hey, wait, the guy you guys claim he was killed, the guy who was arrested for Tom Mboya's death, I saw him in Zambia enjoying a beer. So tell us what's going on. And it was a press, like he came back to Kenya and he held a press conference around that.
So the ghost of Nahashan was in Zambia, according to
Morara.
But at this point, the country knows that he's been executed.
Yes.
So who's telling the truth?
Things get worse because 2 days after this press conference, Morara dies in a tragic accident.
Aha. Was it a car accident?
Yes, it was a car.
Okay.
Yeah. So we see that more question marks, right?
Yeah.
But also what Mboya had fought for now starts dwindling. The 7% that had gone up in and the 10% that had gone up in nominal figures starts plunging. So Anyang' Nyong'o is the one who takes the seat of Mboya in economic planning and everything. But after Mboya is dead, there's a paper that comes out and it basically criticizes Kenyans and what they're doing. And they say, you're not even following the secessional paper number 10 that you brought out. So you're plunging, like we were literally going down year by year. And it was a very sad thing. And now the story of neocolonialism comes in very strongly into the country. And it's like all eyes are on Kenya in a way. Yeah. Because they're like, what's going on in your country? Like, what's really going on? And it's at this point where his friend, J.M. Kariuki, comes out and he actually talks about we don't want to have 10 millionaires and 10 million beggars, which also becomes an issue.
Which we will discuss
later. Yeah. But you can see the aftermath of this man, that what he had fought for very vigorously is now dwindling. Like secessional paper number 10 is not really being applied. There's nothing working, basically. And we can also see that during that time, of course, Ngala was also in government. And whatever he had fought for in the Lancaster is also not working. What we now, the Majimbo
Constitution.
So it's a mess after this man passes on, but we can't really take away from his contributions. Yeah. This man was an orator. And something very beautiful that we can still see, like he left a legacy and this person took over that legacy, is the daughter. the daughter actually goes back to the one of the biggest contributions of Mboya, which is the airlifts.
Yes.
Yes. So she takes that on, and we will forever remember Mboya and the airlift and his passion of education and having an educated Africa. And one of the actual main things he fought for when he was fighting for different social assets for the country is he was a realist. He was like, we can't afford this as a country. We can't do this as a country. But we can't have free social services for everyone.
Yes.
But one thing that we can make free is free tertiary education.
Yes.
So from 5, from 6,
and university.
He fought for that. Yeah. So I think I'll leave this by just saying that Tom Mboya, by how Ogot describes Tom Mboya. He was a realist. He was not a tribalist, and he believed in a sense that the freedom of a country and the freedom of a unified Africa is like a marathon. It's very, very long. So yeah,
that's beautiful. Mboya is remembered to this date. It's been 55 years since his assassination. He's been remembered in many forms. We have a street named after him right next to the archives where the famous Tom Mboya statue was erected. We also have a play that's been going on during his 55th year of assassination that delves into his life story. And I don't think Mboya could ever be forgotten, no matter how old this country grows, because of his contributions. Despite his comments towards Kodek's white wife, despite the age gap between him and Pamela, despite the fact that many believed he was a Western stooge simply because he was friends with people in American politics who helped him fund airlifts. And despite also the fact that some of them helped him plan Sensational Paper Number 10, Mboya was still a visionary. He was still looking out for the country. And it's been put very well that Mboya's death pushed us back 30 years, and it will take a long time before another man comes around that could measure up to Mboya. So, as usual, all the links to our sources will be linked in the description below. We thank you so much for joining us on this story. If there's anything we've missed at all, please let us know in the comments, and we will look forward to seeing you guys in the next one.